My name is Sarah, and 3 years ago, my ex-husband did something so unforgivable that it changed me forever. He took our children and disappeared without a trace, leaving me broken and desperate. What he didn't know was that his betrayal would awaken something inside me that would ultimately destroy everything he had built. If you're watching this right now, drop a comment letting me know where you're from and hit that subscribe button, because this story will show you exactly what happens when someone pushes a mother too far. I met David when I was 26, working as a marketing coordinator at a small firm downtown. He was charming in that dangerous way that makes your heart skip beats, and your friends worry about you. David owned a successful construction company, drove expensive cars, and had this confidence that made every room feel smaller when he walked in. Our whirlwind romance lasted exactly 8 months before he proposed with a ring that cost more than my annual salary. Looking back now, I can see all the red flags I ignored, how he needed to know where I was every moment of the day, how he slowly convinced me to quit my job because his business was doing so well, and wouldn't it be nice if I could focus on making our home perfect? How his compliments always came with subtle criticisms attached. You look beautiful tonight, but maybe next time, try the blue dress instead. The house looks great, but don't you think we should rearrange the living room? But I was young and thought his attention meant love. When you're 27 and someone successful wants to take care of you, it feels like winning the lottery. I gave up my career, my independence, and slowly, piece by piece, myself. Our twins Emma and Jake were born 2 years into our marriage. David seemed thrilled to be a father, posting endless photos on social media and bragging to anyone who would listen about his perfect family. For a while, things felt genuinely good. He was attentive to the babies, helpful around the house, and we fell into what I thought was a comfortable routine. But something shifted when the kids turned 3. David became increasingly controlling about how I raised them. He criticized my parenting constantly, claiming I was too soft, too emotional, too indulgent. When Emma cried, I was spoiling her. When Jake wanted affection, I was making him weak. Every decision I made as their mother was scrutinized and found lacking. The arguments started small but escalated quickly. David would come home from work in these dark moods, looking for reasons to find fault with everything I had done that day. The house wasn't clean enough. Dinner wasn't ready on time. The children were too loud, too messy, too needy. I found myself walking on eggshells, trying desperately to anticipate his moods and prevent the explosions that seemed to come out of nowhere. I started keeping a journal during this time, documenting the incidents that left me questioning my own sanity. David had this way of making every conflict seem like my fault, twisting conversations until I genuinely believed I was the problem. He never hit me, but his words cut deeper than any physical blow could have. "You're pathetic," he would say, during our fights. "No wonder your own parents barely call you. Look at yourself. Who else would want someone like you?" The isolation was perhaps the cruelest part. David systematically severed my connections to friends and family, always with seemingly reasonable explanations. My college roommate was a bad influence. My sister was jealous of our success. My parents lived too far away to really understand our life. One by one, the people who might have helped me see clearly disappeared from my world until it was just me, David, and the children in our beautiful prison. When the twins turned 5, I made my first real attempt to assert some independence. I wanted to enroll them in a local preschool program where they could socialize with other children, and I could have a few hours to myself each day. David exploded. He accused me of wanting to abandon our children, of being selfish and lazy, of trying to shirk my responsibilities as a mother. But I held firm. Something about watching Emma and Jake interact with other kids at the park had shown me how isolated they were becoming. They needed friends, structure, experiences beyond our house. For once, I refused to back down despite David's rage. The preschool became my lifeline. 3 mornings a week, I would drop off the twins and spend precious hours at the local coffee shop, slowly remembering who I used to be. I started reading again, something I had abandoned years earlier. I began writing in my journal more regularly, documenting not just David's behavior, but my own thoughts and feelings. It was at that coffee shop that I met Lisa, another mom whose daughter was in the twins class. Lisa was everything David had taught me to distrust: independent, outspoken, divorced, and absolutely unapologetic about her choices. She worked as a paralegal at a family law firm and had stories about women who had escaped situations far worse than mine. Our friendship developed slowly. Lisa never pushed or pried, but she listened when I needed to talk and offered perspective when I was ready to hear it. She helped me understand that David's behavior wasn't normal, wasn't my fault, and most importantly, wasn't something I had to endure forever. The day I decided to leave, Emma came home from school with a bruise on her arm. When I asked what happened, she said Daddy had grabbed her too hard when she spilled juice on his papers. The casual way she said it, like it was perfectly normal, made my blood run cold. I realized that my children were learning to accept treatment I had spent years normalizing. That night, while David was at a work dinner, I called Lisa. She talked me through my options, helped me understand my rights, and most importantly, assured me that leaving was possible. We made a plan. I would gather important documents, open a separate bank account, and document David's behavior more systematically. For 3 weeks, I prepared in secret. I photographed important papers, saved money from grocery shopping, and began recording David's outbursts on my phone. Lisa helped me find a lawyer who specialized in custody cases involving controlling spouses. Everything was falling into place for our escape. The morning I planned to leave, David's behavior was particularly volatile. He had screamed at Jake for leaving toys in the living room and reduced Emma to tears by criticizing her artwork. As I watched my children shrink away from their father, I knew I was making the right choice. I waited until David left for work, then quickly packed bags for myself and the twins. My hands shook as I loaded our clothes, their favorite toys, and the documentation I had been gathering. The plan was simple: pick up the children from school and drive to Lisa's house, where we would stay until I could find a more permanent solution. But when I arrived at the school that afternoon, the teacher looked confused. "Your husband picked them up early," she said. "About an hour ago. He said there was a family emergency." My world stopped. David never picked up the children early. He barely knew their school schedule. With growing panic, I called his cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. I drove to his office, but his secretary said he had left for the day and wouldn't be back until next week. That's when I found the note on our kitchen counter, written in David's precise handwriting. "You made your choice, Sarah. Now I'm making mine. Don't try to find us. Don't involve the police. This is what happens when you try to destroy a family." The house felt impossibly quiet as the reality sank in. He had taken my children, and somehow he had known about my plans to leave. 3 days passed with no word, no trace, no sign that Emma and Jake were even alive. I called the police on the 4th day, but their response was frustratingly bureaucratic. Since David was the children's father, and there was no formal custody agreement in place, they treated it as a domestic dispute rather than a kidnapping. The officer who took my report was sympathetic, but explained that without evidence of immediate danger to the children, their hands were tied. Lisa helped me hire a private investigator, a gruff former police detective named Marcus who specialized in missing persons cases. Within a week, he had traced David's movements to a small town 3 states away where David had apparently been planning this for months. He had rented a house under his company's name, enrolled the children in a local school using falsified documents, and even established relationships with neighbors who believed he was a devoted single father whose wife had abandoned the family. The betrayal cut deeper than I thought possible. While I had been planning my escape, David had been orchestrating his own. Every time I thought I was being clever, documenting his behavior or hiding money, he had been 10 steps ahead, creating an entirely new life that didn't include me. Marcus showed me surveillance photos of my children walking to school with David, playing in their new backyard, seemingly adjusting to their stolen life. Emma had grown taller, her hair longer than I remembered. Jake clutched a stuffed animal I didn't recognize. They looked healthy, but different somehow, like shadows of the children I knew. The legal battle that followed was unlike anything I had prepared for. David had hired an expensive attorney who painted me as an unstable mother who had threatened to kidnap the children. They presented my journal entries as evidence of mental instability, twisting my documented fears about David's behavior into proof that I was the dangerous parent. During depositions, David's lawyer grilled me about my friendship with Lisa, suggesting it was evidence of poor judgment and moral corruption. They questioned my decision to secretly record arguments, framing it as manipulative and untrustworthy behavior. Every step I had taken to protect myself and my children was repackaged as evidence against me. David himself was masterful in court, presenting himself as the concerned father who had been forced to take drastic action to protect his children from their increasingly erratic mother. He spoke about my isolation, my lack of friends, my dependence on him as signs of instability rather than the results of his systematic control. The most devastating moment came when the judge ordered supervised visitation only. After 8 months of legal battles, I was allowed to see Emma and Jake for 2 hours every other weekend, with a court-appointed supervisor present to ensure I didn't pose a threat to my own children. That first supervised visit nearly destroyed me. Emma and Jake were polite but distant, like they were meeting a stranger rather than their mother. They called me Sarah instead of Mommy, a change David had clearly encouraged. When I tried to hug them, they stiffened in my arms. Jake asked when Daddy was coming to pick them up, as if my presence was something to be endured rather than enjoyed. The supervisor, a stern woman named Mrs. Patterson, watched our every interaction with clinical detachment. When Emma started crying because she missed her favorite doll that we had left behind, I wasn't allowed to comfort her properly because it might be seen as manipulation. When Jake asked why I had left them, I couldn't explain the truth because it might be considered parental alienation. For 2 years, I lived in this nightmare. Every other weekend, I would sit in that sterile visitation room, watching my children grow up through snapshots of supervised time. They told me about their new school, their new friends, their new life with Daddy. David had convinced them that I had abandoned them, that I was sick and needed help, that they were better off without me. My lawyer, a well-meaning but overworked public defender, kept promising that things would improve with time. We filed motion after motion requesting expanded visitation, challenging David's custody arrangement, presenting evidence of his controlling behavior. But David's expensive legal team countered every move with sophisticated arguments and character assassinations that made me look increasingly desperate and unstable. The breaking point came during a particularly difficult visit when Jake, now 7 years old, looked at me with David's eyes and said, "Daddy says you tried to hurt us." That's why we had to leave. The casual way he delivered this lie, believing it completely, shattered something inside me that had been barely holding together. That night, I sat in my tiny apartment, surrounded by the remnants of my old life, photos and toys, and memories of the children who no longer knew me as their mother. I realized that playing by the rules, following the legal system, trusting in justice had only made things worse. David had used my faith in fairness against me, weaponizing my own moral code to steal my children and destroy my credibility. Lisa found me the next morning, still sitting on my couch in the same clothes from the day before. She took one look at my face and knew something fundamental had changed. "You're done trying to be the good guy," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. She was right. The woman who had spent 2 years begging judges and lawyers and social workers for scraps of time with her own children was gone. In her place was someone harder, someone who understood that David's game could only be beaten by someone willing to play it better than he did. Marcus, the private investigator, had kept in touch throughout the legal proceedings, updating me on David's life in his new town. He had become something of a local celebrity, the successful businessman who had rescued his children from a troubled situation. He dated a local teacher named Rebecca, who doted on Emma and Jake like they were her own. His construction company had expanded into the new market, landing several lucrative municipal contracts. But Marcus had also uncovered something else, something that David thought was buried so deep it would never surface. Financial irregularities in his business that dated back years, payoffs to city officials for permits and contracts, tax evasion schemes that had saved him hundreds of thousands of dollars, a pattern of corruption that would destroy everything he had built if the right people learned about it. The old Sarah would have turned this information over to the authorities immediately, trusting that justice would prevail. But I wasn't the old Sarah anymore. I had learned from David himself that information was power, and power was only useful when applied strategically. I started making phone calls, not to lawyers or judges, but to people who understood how the world really worked. A journalist friend of Lisa's who specialized in corruption stories. A former client of David's who had always suspected something wasn't right about their contract. A competitor who would benefit from David's downfall. Slowly, carefully, I began building a web around David that he couldn't see coming. Every thread was legal, every move was calculated, every step was designed to look like natural consequences rather than deliberate action. The first crack appeared when the local newspaper in David's new town published an investigative series about municipal corruption. David's name appeared in the third article, identified as a contractor who had received unusually favorable treatment from city officials. The article didn't directly accuse him of wrongdoing, but it raised questions that other people would want answered. Within days of the article's publication, David's carefully constructed new life began showing stress fractures. The city council announced they would be reviewing all construction contracts awarded in the past 5 years. The IRS received an anonymous tip about discrepancies in his tax filings. His biggest client suddenly postponed their upcoming project, citing budget concerns that everyone knew were really about reputation management. I watched it all unfold from 3 states away, monitoring local news websites and social media pages like a detective tracking a case. Marcus provided regular updates, describing how David's confident swagger was replaced by nervous energy. He was making mistakes now, snapping at employees, losing his temper with Rebecca, becoming the kind of man his new community was starting to question. But the real breakthrough came when Emma called me during one of our supervised visits. For the first time in 2 years, she sounded like my little girl instead of a stranger reciting lines. "Mommy," she whispered when Mrs. Patterson stepped out to answer her phone. "Daddy has been really angry lately. He yells at Jake when he cries, and he broke a plate last night." My heart stopped. The mask was slipping. Under pressure, David was reverting to his true nature. The controlling man who had driven me away was now revealing himself to our children. Emma's innocent observation confirmed what I had hoped would happen. When David felt threatened, he became dangerous to everyone around him. I couldn't ask Emma questions without violating the court's rules about parental alienation, but I listened carefully to everything she shared during our remaining time together. Daddy locked himself in his office for hours. Rebecca had stopped coming over as much. Jake was having nightmares, but was afraid to tell Daddy about them. The picture she painted was of a household under siege, where the charming facade David had maintained was crumbling under the weight of mounting investigations and scrutiny. I felt a dark satisfaction knowing that my children were finally seeing their father's true face, even though it pained me that they had to experience his volatility firsthand. 2 weeks later, Marcus called with news that changed everything. The state attorney general's office had opened a formal investigation into David's business practices. Federal agents had executed a search warrant on his office, seizing computers and financial records. Local television crews had filmed the whole thing, broadcasting images of David being escorted from his building in handcuffs. But the best part was what happened next. Rebecca, the sweet teacher, who had been playing stepmother to my children, apparently decided that dating a suspected criminal wasn't compatible with her career goals. She ended their relationship publicly, making sure everyone in their small town knew she wanted nothing to do with David's legal troubles. Suddenly, the devoted single-father narrative David had crafted began collapsing. Neighbors who had praised his parenting started remembering incidents they had previously overlooked. Emma coming to school with bruises she claimed were from falling. Jake's increasing withdrawal from other children. The way David spoke to them in public with barely concealed irritation. The school guidance counselor, a mandatory reporter, finally made the call I had been hoping for. Child Protective Services opened an investigation into David's household, documenting the same controlling behaviors I had tried to escape years earlier. But now, instead of being dismissed as the bitter ex-wife, I was vindicated by independent observers who could see what I had always known. The irony was perfect. David's attempts to steal my children had placed them in a situation where his true nature would inevitably surface. Without me there to absorb his anger and control his image, he had no choice but to direct his toxicity toward Emma and Jake. The very children he claimed to be protecting were now experiencing firsthand why I had tried to leave. My lawyer, energized by the shifting dynamics, filed an emergency motion for custody modification. For the first time in 2 years, we weren't asking the court to give me more time with my children. We were asking them to remove Emma and Jake from an increasingly dangerous situation. The hearing was unlike anything from our previous legal battles. Instead of character assassination and manipulation, we presented documented evidence of David's criminal activities. Testimony from teachers and neighbors about his deteriorating behavior, and reports from Child Protective Services confirming that our home environment was harmful to the children. David's expensive attorney tried to maintain their strategy of painting me as unstable, but it rang hollow now that their client was facing federal charges. When David took the stand to defend himself, his composure finally cracked completely. He ranted about conspiracies and persecution, blamed everyone else for his problems, and displayed the exact kind of volatile behavior that had driven me away years earlier. The judge, a stern woman who had presided over our case from the beginning, looked disgusted as David's mask fell away completely. She had seen his charming act during previous hearings, but now she was witnessing the man I had lived with for years. When he started shouting at her about bias and corruption, court security had to restrain him. 3 days later, I received a phone call that I had dreamed about for 2 years. Emma and Jake were being placed in my custody pending the resolution of David's legal issues. The supervised visits were over. My children were coming home. But victory felt more complicated than I had imagined. When the social worker brought Emma and Jake to my apartment, they were shell-shocked and confused. The past 2 years had been traumatic for them in ways I was only beginning to understand. David had poisoned them against me so thoroughly that they viewed their return as punishment rather than rescue. Emma, now 8 years old, asked why she couldn't stay with Rebecca, even though Rebecca had made it clear she wanted nothing to do with their situation. Jake, barely 6, kept asking when Daddy would come get them, unable to understand that Daddy might be going to prison. They had been taught to see me as the enemy, and undoing that programming would require patience I wasn't sure I possessed. The first few weeks were the hardest of my life. My children treated me like a stranger, questioning every decision I made and comparing everything unfavorably to how things were at Daddy's house. They refused to eat foods they used to love, claiming they weren't allowed to have them anymore. They flinched when I tried to hug them, conditioned to expect emotional manipulation disguised as affection. But slowly, gradually, something beautiful began happening. Away from David's influence, Emma and Jake started remembering who they had been before. Emma rediscovered her love of drawing, creating pictures she had been too afraid to make when David might criticize them. Jake began laughing again, genuine belly laughs that had been missing from his personality for years. The breakthrough moment came about a month after their return. Jake had a nightmare and came running to my room, just like he used to do when he was little. Without thinking, I pulled him into bed with me and held him while he cried about monsters in his closet. When he finally fell asleep in my arms, Emma appeared in my doorway. "Can I stay too?" she whispered. For the first time since David had taken them, both my children chose comfort over the distance they had been taught to maintain. We spent that night curled together in my bed, and when they woke up the next morning, they called me Mommy for the first time in over 2 years. David's trial became a local sensation in his adopted town. The man, who had presented himself as a pillar of the community, was revealed to be a criminal who had stolen public funds and corrupted government officials. But more damaging to his reputation were the custody proceedings that ran parallel to his criminal case. Emma and Jake's testimonies, given in the judge's chambers to protect their privacy, painted a picture of a father who had been psychologically abusive and increasingly unstable. They described being afraid to make noise, being criticized constantly, and being taught to hate their mother through lies and manipulation. The judge's final ruling was everything I had hoped for and more. David lost all parental rights permanently. He was prohibited from contacting Emma and Jake in any way. When he was eventually sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for corruption and tax evasion, my children were finally free from his influence forever. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when David's former community learned the whole truth about what had happened. The local newspaper that had helped expose his crimes published a follow-up story about the custody case, revealing how he had kidnapped his own children and manipulated an entire town into supporting his deception. The people who had praised him as a devoted father felt betrayed and used. His former employees spoke publicly about his abusive management style. Even his defense attorney eventually admitted that David had lied to him about the circumstances surrounding the custody dispute. The construction company that had been David's pride and joy collapsed within months of his conviction. His assets were seized to pay restitution to the government and victims of his fraud. The house where he had hidden my children was sold to cover his legal debts. Everything he had built through manipulation and crime was systematically dismantled. 3 years later, as I watch Emma and Jake play in our backyard, I sometimes think about the woman I used to be. The naive person who believed that being good and following rules would protect her from people who had no such limitations. That woman would be horrified by some of the tactics I used to destroy David's life. But I'm not sorry. David taught me that the world doesn't reward goodness, it rewards strategy. He showed me that people who play by different rules will always have an advantage over those who trust in fairness and justice. The only way to beat someone like David is to become someone he can't outmaneuver. My children are thriving now, attending therapy to help them process their trauma, but growing stronger every day. Emma wants to be a lawyer when she grows up, inspired by watching our legal battles. Jake has started playing soccer and making friends, rediscovering the social skills David had tried to suppress. They ask about their father sometimes, and I tell them age-appropriate truths about why he can't be part of our lives. They're too young to understand the full scope of what happened, but they're old enough to know that we're safer without him. The best revenge wasn't just destroying David's life, though that was deeply satisfying. The best revenge was proving that his fundamental belief about me was wrong. He thought I was weak, dependent, broken. He thought taking my children would crush me permanently. Instead, losing them taught me exactly how strong I could become when everything I loved was at stake. David created his own worst enemy the day he decided to steal my children. He just didn't realize it until it was too late to stop what he had set in motion. Sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet and my children are sleeping peacefully in their beds, I allow myself to feel something I never thought I would experience again. Pride. Not the shallow kind that comes from small victories, but the deep, bone-deep satisfaction of knowing I fought the most important battle of my life and won. The years since David's imprisonment have brought healing I didn't think was possible. Emma, now 11, has developed in fierce independence that reminds me of myself before I met her father. She questions everything, trusts carefully, and stands up for herself in ways I never taught her, but somehow she learned anyway. Jake, 9 years old and growing taller every month, has retained his gentle nature, but found his voice. He no longer shrinks away from conflict or apologizes for taking up space. Their recovery hasn't been linear. There are still moments when David's psychological damage surfaces unexpectedly. Emma sometimes panics when I'm running late, convinced I've abandoned her like she was taught to believe I had before. Jake occasionally asks if he's being too loud or too messy, echoes of his father's impossible standards still haunting him. But these episodes are becoming rarer, replaced by the natural confidence of children who know they are unconditionally loved. The transformation in our daily life is remarkable. Our small house feels more like home than the mansion David and I shared ever did. Emma's artwork covers the refrigerator without fear of criticism. Jake's toys scattered across the living room represent childhood reclaimed rather than chaos to be controlled. We have pancakes for dinner sometimes just because we can, and nobody questions whether we deserve such simple pleasures. My own healing has been more complicated. Learning to trust my instincts again after years of being told they were wrong took time. Making decisions without second-guessing every choice was a skill I had to relearn. But perhaps most challenging was accepting that the woman who destroyed David's life was still fundamentally me. I had to integrate the ruthless strategist I became with the caring mother I had always been. The legal aftermath continued long after David's sentencing. His appeals were rejected one by one. His attempts to contact the children through intermediaries blocked by court orders. The private investigator, Marcus, became something of a friend, checking in periodically to ensure David wasn't finding ways around the restrictions. But as months passed without incident, even those precautions began to feel unnecessary. If you're watching this story and recognizing pieces of your own situation, please know that you're not powerless even when it feels impossible. Sometimes the system fails us. Sometimes playing fair isn't enough. And sometimes you have to become someone stronger than you ever imagined to protect what matters most. Drop a comment about your own experiences with toxic relationships and hit that subscribe button if this resonated with you. Share this with someone who might need to hear that they're capable of more than their abuser ever told them they were. David is serving his sentence in a federal prison 3 states away, and every year that passes makes his influence on our lives smaller and smaller. The children barely mention him anymore, and when they do, it's with the detached curiosity of people discussing someone from a story they once heard rather than someone who shaped their early years. I've learned that sometimes the most important battles aren't won through forgiveness or taking the high road. Sometimes justice requires you to become the person your enemy never expected you to be. David thought he was playing chess while I was playing checkers. But what he didn't realize was that I was learning his game while he was busy celebrating his early victories. The woman who begged courts and lawyers for scraps of time with her own children is gone. In her place is someone who understands that protecting the people you love sometimes requires tactics that would have horrified your former self. I'm not proud of every method I used, but I'm proud of the results. My children are safe, David can never hurt us again, and we built a life together that no one can steal from us. If this story taught you anything, let it be this. When someone shows you who they really are, believe them the first time. And when someone threatens everything you hold dear, become someone they never saw coming. The best revenge isn't just winning. It's proving that their worst mistake was underestimating exactly how far you'll go to protect what matters most.